Hey there guys, it's Metro and welcome to the tank spec tier list for Mythic Plus dungeons made specifically for Battle for Azeroth Season 3. In this video, I will be ranking tanks based on their ability to impact 5-man groups and making direct comparisons along different metrics for all 6 tanking specs. It is made up of purely my opinions, formulated from running and watching thousands of Mythic Plus runs, as well as information from what might be considered the meta and other parsing sites like Raider.io, WoW Progress, and Warcraft logs. One thing that seems to always confuse people is that this list is ranking tanks without key level or overall difficulty curve as the sole determination. Many common complaints here are that my opinions may not line up with what the leaderboards indicate right now, so it's important to remember that this is considering every possible key, not just ones that the top dozen or so teams in the world might be doing. With that being said, the ranking is made considering 4 primary factors. Number 1, their overall survival kit and how it applies to the dungeon landscape, with magic and physical considered separately but equally. Number 2, their ability to provide significant utility to the group, which I define specifically as abilities that do not directly impact your ability to reduce damage, self-heal, travel, or deal damage, but have a heavy impact on the flow of the content, the capabilities your group might have, and the ability to overcome awkward and dangerous situations that might occur. Number 3, their ability to output damage regularly, easily, and at times most important to the dungeon. And number 4, their mobility and ability to kite when needed. As an aside, we will also note Azerite essences where applicable, as their inclusion in Season 3 has made a big impact on every single spec in the game coming from the previous season. With that made clear, I would also like to say I'll be making a concerted effort to be more precise in this video. As it's the 3rd video like this of the expansion now, I will attempt to only mention information relevant to this specific ranking, meaning why each spot is where it is or how it has changed from Season 2. Ideally, you would have seen the previous tier list to get a better understanding of my overall mindset, but it's not required for this video. So either way, let's begin the rankings. Tier 1, number 1 overall is Protection Paladin. Protection Paladin being number 1 overall may come as a holy shock to those who have followed my list in the past, but with how Beguiling functions and thanks to the essences, I now feel that their very well-rounded kit is just superior to the tanks preceding them. It seems even top key pushers value a variety of things, whether it be offense, defense, or utility, and Paladin now has all they need to shine in a world where all 3 seem equally important for likely the first time since Mythic Plus's inception. In the past, I was down on their utility, and I still do not consider it as good as many others will, but it does offer some very important pieces as a Paladin continues to struggle to find spots in the meta in the DPS and healers roles. Things like Blessing of Protection or Spell Warding can prove absolutely invaluable. For certain dungeons, things like Freedom still have very niche usage though, and the ranged interrupt potential most people think highly of, I still find to be very hit or miss and difficult to maximize without just not using the spell, causing a dramatic lack of defense or offensive output. Either way, what has them standing so very tall right now is just that. Both defense and offense are extremely high and will land them near the top on every metric there is to equate for it. Defensively, they have only improved thanks to essences like Vision of Perfection and Memory of Lucid Dreams, but most importantly, they feature the only immunity from any tank role, and this allows them to do very powerful and unique things no other tank has access to. Offensively, they weren't far off Warriors in Season 2, and now after 8.2, they have really come into their own, again thanks to essences, which allow for considerably higher offensive output via wings, along with its synergies with the final talent tier. Mobility is obviously their weakest element, but it's not particularly problematic for them thanks to a talented AoE slow on a slam dunk tier for them. They're among the worst in mobility and aren't the best kiters, but they don't really need to be now thanks to how the tank metagame has progressed. When they do need to close the gaps or kite, they can still do so relatively well for sure. In the end, the overall summary of Paladin is a tank with extremely consistent defensive elements that allow them to reduce both magic and physical damage well, do a capable amount of self-healing, all while outputting immense physical damage pack to pack. Their utility can be irreplaceable at times, but is slightly overrated in my eyes overall, and their mobility and kiting kit is good enough for when it's needed most. Special nod goes to essences for granting them the most unique and powerful essences the system can offer, solidifying their place as the number 1 tank for all-around Mythic Plus pursuits. Tier 1, number 2. Number 2 overall is Protection Warrior. Prot Warrior has the best hype man in the game's history, if you ask me. Thanks to an absurd overbuffing coming out of a dire Season 1, nearly every top tank in the Mythic Plus game regarded their combination of offense and huge physical bulk as simply irreplaceable in Season 2 with Reaping Spam. Now, things have settled down a bit, but they still have retained what made them top dog in Season 2 pretty well. Offense, even after a small nerf, remains as their pride and joy. They will still likely be top overall damage tank for dungeon-to-dungeon comparisons, but when so much of it comes from Thunderclap, it's hard for me to feel particularly gratified by that concept on tyrannical weeks. Defensively, they certainly haven't gotten any worse, but I still have a lot of trouble respecting their ability to handle magic damage consistently. The least self-healing of any tank, coupled with no consistent answer to magic damage, just makes them obviously worse than Paladin in this way, and many other tanks as well. But when physical is all you need, they can be absolute walls. The way they mitigate can be looked at as a benefit in comparison to a tank like Brewmaster, whom will handle damage better overall, but will need much more help from the healer in order to do so. In terms of kiting and mobility, they remain comfortably where they were in Season 2. They have above average mobility, but it does require a lot of targeting to make use of, which can be limited now, especially without reaping in play. And kiting just seems to be less and less valuable, so even though they are among the weakest kiters right now, it obviously doesn't hurt them, especially because kiting means losing DPS. Their utility can be interesting at times though. Spell Reflect is likely the most notable piece in their entire kit, and even though it's difficult to quantify properly, it can account for quite a lot of output if used well in certain dungeons. However, it is often useless overall in others. They are still the only tank you will see use a group-wide defensive spell like Rally, but it continues to have low impact in 5-mans this expansion. Luckily, they possess the best AoE stun of any tank. They possess Safeguard, a talent often not taken over Crackling Thunder, but one that does provide some niche but high value survivability if needed. Essences again have made a dramatic impact on this specific ranking though, and likely Warrior should be universally considered second most if not first most helped by these essences. Just like Prop Pally, Vision of Perfection and Memory of Lucid Dreams just help them so much it's absurd, but mostly it further embeds their offense as a mainstay in this meta thanks to just how many talents synergize with spending Rage into Avatar. So you know what you're getting if you pick a Warrior. A brick wall against physical and a mud wall against magic. One of the best DPS outputs any tank iteration has ever produced, but 40% of it's going to be Thunderclap, meaning their single target is not going to seem overly impressive to anyone. A unique and wide utility kit that features huge swings of power with abilities like Spell Reflect and Rallying Cry, but very low usage dungeon to dungeon, and incredible synergy bolstered further by essences combined with talents for their surroundings. Likely the most complete design of any tank spec going at this current moment. And final slot in Tier 1, number 3 overall is Brewmaster Monk. Brewmaster rounds off Tier 1 as a third pick thanks heavily to Beguiling. Brewmaster has been a capable pick all expansion, mostly due to their increased ability to reduce and self-sustain against hectic moments, potent single-target offense, and a reinvigorated utility kit. Now thanks to Season 3, those things have become truly more important. Many who have been following the leaderboards for top keys and MDI would see a considerable amount more Brewmaster representation than in the past, and that is good to see because it means those players are thinking more about what the tank can bring to a group instead of how to simply maximize their offense. Right now, utility is king for Brewmaster, and they can very easily be looked at as the best utility tank for all 5-mans thanks to Beguiling. Ring of Peace has always been a unique spell that has allowed for odd skips and unique kiting, but now it can make moments of huge impacts happen much easier against emissaries. Isolating or even split pulling with Ring of Peace turns complex trash packs into considerably more basic ones, and this is something to look forward to an entire season ahead of us. An unsung hero in the utility department can easily be their buff Mystic Touch, which is a flat 5% physical damage increase, similar to Warriors in their use case, but much better as it cannot be brought in any form with the scroll. Of course, if you follow the MDI, you'll see why classes might want a 5% physical damage buff. And it should never be forgotten that they are one of 2 tanks with an AoE stun. Not much needs to be said about Brewmaster's defensive capability this season. They remain the best tank for smoothing damage intake, and this allows them to make hectic and dangerous moments or even flat-out mistakes look like nothing happened. They will never be the best tank for magic damage, and they will never be the best self-sustained tank, but it has only gotten better for them in Season 3 thanks to essences and gear availability, and it was already better in Season 2 than it was in the previous days. Their offense remains an interesting point of discussion, as I personally am excited for their Conflict and Strife essence, which was out of control during PTR testing, but has since been nerfed to a much more realistic state and has dramatically improved improved their offensive capabilities overall. However, their AoE damage has always been weak outside of their burst in Keg Smash and breath combo, so it may be best to focus on improving their already very strong and consistent single target damage. This season especially, it strikes me as particularly useful. Their Essence Spread likely provide the two most unique picks to any tank thanks to Conflict and Strife, and how Sphere of Suppression can be extremely good with how Stagger works, but otherwise their options are not exceptional like those above them. They arguably have the worst Vision of Perfection and absolutely do have the worst Memory of Lucid Dreams, and will get the least value out of many other essences like Anima. Obviously, Monk remains top tank for kiting, very high in terms of mobility as well. If they can afford to use Ring to kite, they are never going to take any damage if they do not want to. So Monk can be seen as a popular pick right now in high keys. They obviously will always feature great overall bulk thanks to the stagger mechanic, but they have flavorful utility even more so this season thanks to Ring and the meta physical damage buff. Still, I would have them as third overall, with clear weaknesses shown against heavy magic damage, weak AoE DPS requiring an active essence to maximize, and complicated by being one of two tanks without an offensive CD. If they received higher impact essence options, they could easily be seen as the best tank right now, and even as is, they're an extremely capable tank, especially in groups with 3 melee. Tier 2, number 1. Number 4 overall is Blood Death Knight. In this ranking, Blood DK is alone on Tier 2, and that obviously pains me, but they just haven't improved as much of the other tanks have, and already have had an identity crisis for the most competitive keys that might make people notice. If there was a single thing to point to for issues with Blood, it's that they just don't have their niche line up with any element of high value this season. This can be best understood by examining a range of all keystones and trying to understand what Blood DK does best in each scenario present. Upon doing so, you quickly realize that in the highest of keys, content, physical bulk is more valuable than high self-sustain, and there isn't enough moments where magic damage might challenge a tank to make Blood DK seem like the best choice. Their burst AoE DPS remains very strong though, thanks to Dancing Rune Weapon and the Eternal Rune Weapon trait coupled with Bone Storm, but never will stand up to those above them, and unlike those tanks, they weren't gifted a magical essence to reduce their offensive CD by an unneeded amount. Their enormous self-sustain looks flashy and impressive, but its values rarely higher than pure physical reduction nowadays. Blood DK still have an incredible ability to legitimately need zero assistance from a healer on many trash packs, and this should translate to the healer being able to carry the group easier and contribute more damage, but so often other mechanics damaging the damage dealers or just a lack of concern for offense leaves their potential greatest benefit being squandered. Speaking of benefits, it's an odd thing to consider Grip and Gorfiends not the best utility available in the game for 5-mans. I still consider it to be an invaluable tool, and coupled with Battle Res, still believe they have a standout utility kit, but it just does not serve them as well with Beguiling. Gripping the emissaries is rarely something you will ever want to do, and if only the Void Emissary could be moved, it could have been vastly useful again in the meta. Kiting is still extremely easy as Blood DK, and thanks to the March of the Damned trait only getting stronger in relationship to other traits this season, they have actually become quite passable at all things movement related. Essences aren't transformative for Blood though, and sadly our Vision of Perfection, which could have easily been Dancing Rune Weapon or even Bone Storm, ended up being Vampiric Blood, which usually ends up being seen as too random or not needed in comparison to the others, and on top of this, Blood DK received a very poor Conflict and Strife option. So as mentioned, their strengths just don't align with what many consider important for 5-mans right now. Solo potential and things like Grip just don't register, and with their lack of consistent physical reduction, it's understandable how the top groups might be cautious. However, they are still extremely potent for mid-tier keys, and when maximized can turn a poorly optimized comp into a great one. Things like huge self-healing and big utility are frankly never out of season, even if they aren't needed for the most challenging parts of some keys today. That is why they are not on Tier 1, and that is why they are alone in Tier 2. Tier 3, number 1, Vengeance Demon Hunter. The two remaining tanks, that being Vengeance and Bear, were in a very poor state in Season 2 and have been given tremendous buffs coming into Season 3. But when I talk about tanks and their potency, I often talk about having that it factor. The tank must have something that truly makes them stand out, and that thing that makes them stand out needs to dominate dungeons in a way that makes them seem irreplaceable for some niched reason. As just discussed for Blood DK, their it factor of big self-sustain and Gorf Fiend's Grasp are as potent as would ever be needed, but they just don't elevate themselves this way in today's dungeon meta. Sadly, the same can be said about Vengeance, who likely slot behind every other tank in every important measurable metric. If there was one thing to know as their it factor though, I would have to say it's their mobility. I would consider Vengeance the most mobile tank, thanks to a low cooldown 2-charge jump, and of course, their ability to glide. In Legion, the ability to glide was extremely important for kiting, but it can still have usage in BFA dungeons, and where it's usable, it's absolutely irreplaceable. It's good to be great at something, but when it's mobility, it's hard to find its value in 5-mans at all right now, especially coupled with their lack of consistent slows, making their kiting very weak overall, despite their extreme mobility. In the end, mobility and kiting in general, no matter how strong you are at it, just aren't something that most tanks would look at as a useful thing in Season 3. Still, they received major defensive buffs in Season 3, mostly tied to Metamorphosis. Meta went from being the worst defensive CD in the game to one of the best, if not the best, but it again exists in a world where big CDs for huge pulls don't dictate the way the route progresses as much as it used to in the previous iterations of 5-man content. Their vision of perfection essence plus the talent gluttony can turn them into extremely high HP creatures with the potential for extreme survival and even very high solo potential, likely matching Blood DKs. With all that together, they can easily be considered even better than Blood DK for very difficult keys just because they have the same self-healing and more reliable reductions. The problem is, without Spirit Bomb, which shares a row with the Gluttony talent, their offense is very weak. With it, they are a very capable damage tank, but again lack a true offensive CD, and even with small buffs to Meta's offensive capability, will never really stand up to those above them. This situation specifically is what plagues Demon Hunter the most right now, and nowhere else can it be seen clearer than in their utility kit. Since the beginning of this expansion, I have been heavily praising their utility as offering the widest kit of any tank by no small margin, and it truly does. They have an AoE grip, an AoE silence, an AoE fear, a single target CC, a purge, and of course a 5% magic buff, all of which you should be quite pleased with having. But again, all of these things just aren't really needed in today's meta. And even when you have so many things, if almost none of them have any real use cases, it's hard to be high on their overall position. So reflecting on where Vengeance is right now is not something that should disappoint anyone playing it. The buffs they got in 8.2 were massive, and they were truly needed. It turned them from paper outside of active mitigation into a very capable tank in terms of all-around bulk. They now possess an extremely strong kit for all-around tanking, with solid offense, solid utility, top-tier mobility, very serious self-healing, and a much more than capable response to magic damage. Vengeance should be looked at as perhaps the most complete all-around tank now, and something to recommend for anyone looking to play a tank that is not worried about the hyper-specialization that is absolutely needed by tanks looking to compete at the highest level and push their groups forward at all costs. And tier 3, number 2, that's number 6 overall, is the Guardian Druid. Bears have been consistently viewed as the 6th best tank in the previous 2 seasons thus far, and there's just no reason to believe anything should be changing here in Season 3, at least for me. Just like Vengeance, Bear got massive buffs, but continues to lack a true it factor that would make them stand out amongst other tanks. With Bear, it's even more problematic, because whereas Vengeance has amazing utility and mobility, and just lacks a use case for it, Bear just doesn't have any of these major upsides. If you looked at what Bear is best at, you would clearly see they do extremely well against consistent physical damage and will be able to output very high offense against very high volume mobs. But when compared to any tank above them, you see the bad news rise. Their physical bulk is not ever going to be better than Warrior or Brewmaster. Their overall damage is going to be too inconsistent and volume reliant to compete in reality with Warrior or Paladin, mostly because they lack an offensive CD, of course. Their self-healing was dramatically buffed this season, but it surely is still worse than Blood and Vengeance, and we have already discussed the lack of value in that niche. Their utility is quite wide and even got a small buff with the ability to dispel curse in bear form, but lacks the specialization and usage of those above them. Their mobility is almost exclusively good because of cat form, and that means very low mobility in combat. Their kiting potential is strong, but obviously not better than monks or death knights. Their magic bulk has gotten much better thanks to the self-healing buff and of course essences, but all tanks can basically claim the same under these certain conditions. Their high HP looks great on paper and may have some good synergies in certain dungeons, but isn't remarkable when compared to Blood DK or Vengeance. And most importantly, their essences just do very little compared to most tanks. Their Conflict and Strife and Vision to Perfection major essences can bolster an already potent AoE DPS kit and are actually rather unique, but in the end, the only thing of value they would likely want would be some type of big offensive CD so they could also shine on boss fights or packs with important priority targeting. Hopefully all of this paints a clear picture of why Bear Bear is where it is on my list. They're actually a very strong tank, and if all you need is offense and overall bulk, you could do much worse than by playing Bear. But when making side-by-side comparisons, it's hard to see them win a single one. If you disagree specifically with this, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what exactly Bear does better than other tanks, and why this should elevate them specifically up the tier list. But even after many buffs and flexibility that they have displayed of late, I still struggle to see their niche developing and 5-man's past where it is currently. So that's the tier list. What'd you think? I want to remind everyone that these are exclusively my opinions, and yours certainly may differ. Many players may look at participation rates or leaderboards as a form of factual evidence for or against certain things said here, but it's much more pertinent to examine the entire kit, the dungeons, and the ups and downs each might present to try to understand why the representation is what it is, and not just blindly assume that it coincides perfectly with the hierarchy of these specs. It's especially frustrating when people just think because tanks are being used a certain way in the MDI, that means that they are universally important for all skill levels and keystone levels. Instead, I try to study the theory behind each tank spec in an attempt to help better understand why they are being represented in this way, and believe that this will help form a more complete opinion than otherwise. Anyway, if you disagree with this list, I encourage you to tell me why, but I must ask that out of respect to the time this took to make, you are prepared to compare all 6 tanks along whichever metric you wish to give your opinion on. Far too many replies are people simply disagreeing with typically my last 2 picks, but if you aren't willing to compare those picks to the top picks and explain why those picks should be higher, then you are entirely missing the point of this video, and I simply won't have time to communicate with people doing this. Typically, I would read and respond to every single comment on every video as it comes in, but instead, this time I'll be making an entirely subsequent video where I read all the comments and reply to them at length to prevent my own opinions from further creating bias in the comments section as it organically grows, and also to allow for a longer form discussion to take place, and so that I can better learn places I might have gone wrong in the video. Anyway, I want to thank you for watching and supporting the channel in the video. You should look forward to more tier lists like this coming next, including a DPS and maybe a healing one, as well as any updates to tanking specifically that might come with 8.2.5. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.